This is a film about the Minneapolis newspapers, the Minneapolis Tribune and the Minneapolis Star. Two very different newspapers, with separate editors, with separate staffs, separate wire services, which serve the people of Minneapolis and the upper Midwest in very different ways. Bob King, former editor of the Minneapolis Evening Star.
Some years ago, the evening newspaper was the only news that people had in their house in the evening. Today, with the electronics, television, bringing in the headline news of the day to many homes, the role of the evening newspaper has changed somewhat. The evening newspaper has to have that news, but it has to tell people a whole lot more. It has to tell people how the news affects them. It has to tell people how they relate to it and how they can work with the news, make their own decisions, run their own lives in a highly complicated society. For those reasons, the Star has made some moves in recent years, adding a consumer investigative team to help people know the right kinds of decisions to make in the marketplace, and investigating of a good many other kinds of stories behind the news, the things that affect people in their daily lives. Now here's the Star newsroom that you see here, where we have 120 people putting out the evening newspaper. You go up to the corner, down the hall to the Tribune newsroom, where their own separate staff, completely separate from the editor on down, puts out the morning newspaper. One of the ways that the Star has tried to become more relevant and meaningful to people in this complicated day is the feature on page 1 of the Star called Column 1, to answer the questions that people had when they could not solve their problem. They didn't have anywhere to turn. Where can they turn? Which we began a couple of years ago, in which people write to the Star with the problems that they've been unable to solve in their daily lives. The Column 1 staff of 7 investigates, solves these problems for people, and while they're doing it, they are dealing with the really important news of the day, which are the challenges at City Hall, the challenges in the marketplace, and the other frustrations for people in a day which is getting very, very complicated. When we began Column 1, we wanted it, first of all, to be a piece of journalism. So we chose a veteran reporter, Debbie Howell, to be its editor. Debbie has taken a journalist's approach to Column 1 and to the problems that people have, and has really originated a lot of news stories out of her column.
There are 8 of us on Column 1. I'm the editor. We have 2 reporters, very experienced, full-time, have covered everything in the city. We have 3 researchers, young, very bright people who do all the research on the problems and help to solve them. We have 2 secretaries who do a very voluminous amount of clerical work, and the many, many letters I send out every day for problems we don't solve but refer. And I do all the writing, pick all the problems, and read every single letter and call that comes in. I never throw anything away. I always look at it and see if it can't possibly be used in the column. If not, if I think it can't be used, about 80% of the time I'll write the person a letter and tell them what I think they ought to do. We work on consumer problems mostly. Businesses all over the country, all over the world. But we call Japan, Guam, get people in here who speak French, German. We've been trying all week, by the way, to get some merchandise somebody ordered from Holland and they haven't received yet. So even if we don't speak the language, we'll find somebody who does. We also do a lot of government problems. If you have a railroad crossing you're not satisfied with, we'll call up the railroad and try to get it fixed. We do neighborhood problems. Rats are running around the vacant house. We'll have the house boarded up by the alderman for you. We try to specialize in problems that people have tried to solve themselves and can't, because they've exhausted every other opportunity. That's the kind we like the best, ones that are toughest. My favorite problem is the one where we got Warren Rixman an Eagle Scout badge. Warren Rixman is a young man who's deaf, who has asthma, and who has partial facial paralysis. Being an Eagle Scout was really important to him, and he had worked for years to become an Eagle Scout. When he had all the badges and all the requirements put together, they told him he couldn't be an Eagle Scout because he was too old. But back when he had started, they told him age would not be a requirement, and he really felt cheated. His sister wrote us a letter, she said he was told first he could continue to earn the requirements past the usual 18 years old, and he fulfilled all the requirements finally when he was
20 and was told he was too old to get the Eagle badge. I feel the Scout office doesn't understand, and the extra time the deaf need to understand the written and oral language. Our family feels it is a real tragedy. He wrote to Column 1 and asked him to help him get his Eagle Scout. But what happened after you wrote to them? What happened?
The first thing we did was find out, did Warren Richmond really deserve that Eagle Scout badge? And we became convinced that he did, and that a terrible injustice had been done to him inadvertently. So we started to work on the problem of compiling all his requirements again and working through the bureaucracy, beginning here all the way to the Boy Scouts National Headquarters, getting together all his applications, his merit badges, all the things he'd done to get the Eagle Scout badge. And it took us 1 year of calls every week before we finally found somebody up there in the national headquarters who believed what we were telling him, and Warren Richmond got cheated. And he finally got his Eagle Scout badge. It was just wonderful. His parents wrote us the most beautiful letter I think we've ever gotten. We got calls and letters from people that just had read about him. They really felt it was great.
How did you feel about it?
Well, I cried. The researcher who solved the problem turned, she says, Warren's got his Eagle Scout badge. And she was just in tears, and goddamn it did the same thing. Sorry about that.
You've seen one way that newspapers serve people. There are other ways.
Chuck Bailey, editor of the Minneapolis Morning Tribune.
The Tribune is a separate newspaper from the Star. It has a separate newsroom and a separate news and editorial staff of 125 men and women. It's also a different newspaper. It's a morning newspaper, and that means it's a results newspaper. The results of the previous day in the world and the nation, as well as in the City Hall and the State House. Collecting those results sends us to a lot of places. For example, we have our own four-man Washington Bureau. I used to work in it before I came back here to be editor. And as you can see from some of the pictures on this office wall, I went to a lot of places with a lot of people when I worked in that office. To political campaigns and conventions, inside the White House, and once even up onto the Great Wall of China. Now other Tribune staffers are going to these and other places to keep up with the news, to bring our readers the results. For example, recently the big story has been in Washington, where the collapse of the Nixon administration was the biggest news of the year. But covering that story meant more than just going to hearings and trials and impeachment proceedings in Washington. It also meant going other places. It meant going with Mr. Nixon on his foreign trips, the successes, the pluses of the late months of his administration. One of those trips was to the Middle East, and we went along. We, in this case, was Al McConaughey, a member of the Tribune's Washington Bureau.
Well, here we are in Egypt. We're here today because Mr. Nixon's in town, paying his respects to the Egyptian people. We've been elsewhere before on behalf of the Minneapolis Tribune. In fact, we've lived in Europe for 3 years, trying to get newspaper stories, especially for the Minneapolis Tribune. We had an enormous outpouring of emotion yesterday in a motorcade. One of the fellows sitting in the bus remarked that if he hadn't seen it, he wouldn't have believed it. I think that's one of the myths about the Egyptian people. The governments have opposed our policies in the past over Israel, but Egyptians have liked Americans as individuals, and they showed that yesterday. I wrote 2 stories for the Minneapolis Tribune yesterday. One was the diplomatic exchange between President Sadat and President Nixon, which they acknowledged a new direction in the relations between both countries. This perhaps was the least important story I could have done for the Minneapolis Tribune. The most important was a color story about the motorcade in which the Egyptians indicated their goodwill toward America as a nation. Feature stories are like fingerprints. no two are alike, and that's why I made a special effort with this one. I wanted to show the atmosphere of the welcome for President Nixon, the frenetic activity, the incredible enthusiasm.
Nixon done everything for Egypt. Make everything done good. Send some tourists, make everything good, make everything happy, make nice hotel you're going to make, and make everything. And so that he say, welcome.
They could help us and settle peace here in this country. We need American industry here to make progress, economical progress here in this country.
Our officer, tourist officer here, Egyptian, this morning he clicked all the camel driver. He asked him, Friday morning, I want everybody have good camel, clean clothes, himself, washing himself well, with a nice perfume, smell well, and he stayed the road about 2 kilometers in each side. In Egyptian music, he make shika shika boom, and the horses dancing and everybody dancing, and make good time, and a lot of tourists come after that.
If you'll forgive me for being self-serving, I might just add that it takes a lot of resources to staff a trip of this sort, and that newspaper representatives of only 2 other Middle Western cities are on this trip with Mr. Nixon. Let me tell you, too, that we'll also be going elsewhere abroad this summer on behalf of the Minneapolis Tribune. We'll be going to Russia with Mr. Nixon. We're going to look at the question of arms control there that's so important to us. And then later on in the summer, we're going to Africa to study the question of drought and starvation against a background of global food shortage, a matter that's very important to all of us. The enthusiastic outpouring yesterday for Mr. Nixon may come as a surprise to some. We're accustomed to thinking of the Egyptians as hostile. But that's the issue of Israel, of course. And now they think we have a new approach. We'll find out a little more about that on the other side.
Well, here we are in Israel. This is the shrine of the book, and under that dome are the Dead Sea Scrolls. What we've learned so far is that they not only like us in Egypt, they like us as well in Israel, although they're not quite as outspoken about it.
Like I said, I hope that it will bring peace. It's the thing that all the people are hoping here.
I hope that Egypt really wants peace. To know an idea of both of the sides, 2 sides, and I hope he will do more than his best to do something.
This is the first tour of the Middle East ever undertaken by an American president. It's the first time that he's visited Syria, first time he's visited Saudi Arabia, and oddly enough, it's the first time an American president has been in Israel, a long-time ally of the United States. We started in Cairo, went to Alexandria, and then on to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia and Damascus in Syria. Now we're here in Jerusalem. Tomorrow we'll go to Amman in Jordan. You may wonder why we're here. My answer to that is that I'm trying to find something unique for the Minneapolis Tribune. Stories to be published in the Minneapolis newspaper that can't be found anywhere else. I guess that's what they mean again when they say only in the Minneapolis Tribune.
That, in a way, is the difference. 2 newspapers with separate editors, separate staffs, separate newsrooms, competing to be first with the news for Minneapolis, for Minnesota, for the upper Midwest. Different kinds of journalism for people with a need to know about the city, about the world.